Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare open the second meeting of the 47th session of the Human Rights Council. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now begin the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, who will present his report pursuant to Council Resolution 44/1. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to Mr. Mohammed Abdul Salam Babikar for a video message.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present my first report to the Council since taking up the role of Special Rapporteur last November 2020. The report covers the period from 5th of May 2020 to 28th of April 2021 and provides an assessment of the human rights situation in light of the 5 benchmarks for progress set out in the report of my predecessor, Daniela Kravitz. I would like to thank her for her invaluable support and contributions to the mandate. Since I started my mandate in November 2020, there are no tangible signs of progress or concrete evidence of improvement in the internal human rights situation in Eritrea. In addition, Eritrea extended its human rights violations extraterritorially, or beyond its borders, during this mandate, and committed heinous human rights violations in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Eritrea has not put in place a minimum institutional and legal framework to uphold human rights standards. Serious human rights issues persist, including the use of arbitrary and incommunicable detention, inhumane prison conditions, lack of freedoms of expression, opinion, association, freedom of the media, and the right to participate in political and public affairs. I welcome the release of over 100 Muslims, Orthodox Christians, and Jehovah's Witnesses over the reporting period. This is a step in the right direction. However, faith groups are still detained without being informed of the reasons for their arrest, without charges and trial. It is difficult to speak of progress on the situation of human rights in Eritrea while the authorities continue their policy of arbitrarily detaining persons without any regard to due process of the right to a fair trial. Political prisoners and prisoners of conscience are held incommunicado for indefinite periods and in inhumane conditions. In this respect, I have received consistent accounts from families of detainees, people who escaped Eritrea, and former detainees who were held in secret places of detention. Despite repeated calls from myself, my predecessors, other mandate holders, and judicial decisions by the African human rights system, there is still no information on the whereabouts of the 11 former members of the government held in detention, or the 10 independent journalists, including Mr. Daud Isaac, who were arrested and imprisoned without trial in 2001. I urge the Eritrean authorities to demonstrate their commitment to human rights by releasing all persons deprived of their liberty. I also received testimonies of young persons and reports about human rights violations linked to the indefinite and national military service. The government continues to conscript young Eritreans for prolonged periods of time. Conscripts at Sawa military camp are subjected to forced labor, severe punishments, and sexual violence. As outlined in my report, the national military service also has a negative impact on the access to education. I call on the authorities to urgently reform the national service, which truncates the aspirations of Eritrean youth and pushes them to leave their country. My report also reflects allegations of grave human rights violations and humanitarian law violations committed by the Eritrean troops in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, including deliberate attacks against civilians, summary executions, sexual and gender-based violence, arbitrary detention, abduction, and disappearance of Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers. I am particularly concerned about the allegations of attacks by Eritrean troops targeting Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers, in particular the destruction of the 2 refugee camps, hosting more than 25,000 Eritrean refugees in Ixas and Shemelba. Such allegations must be promptly and fully investigated by independent international mechanisms. I reiterate my call on the government of Ethiopia to effectively protect the Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers, as per its obligations under international refugee law and the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their protocols. I note that the Ethiopian authorities stated in March 2021 and again in June that the withdrawal of the Eritrean forces from Tigray was underway. However, no information has been provided regarding the timeline for the withdrawal, and I have received no verifiable information to suggest progress in this regard. I call on the Eritrean authorities to withdraw their forces from Tigray, to provide information about the whereabouts of the missing Eritrean refugees, and to release any Eritrean refugees held in detention. I would like also to stress the importance of Eritrea strengthening its cooperation with international human rights mechanisms and implementing the recommendations of the UN human rights treaty bodies. I would like also to note that Eritrean authorities have not cooperated with the African human rights mechanisms, including non-compliance or implementation of decisions issued by the African Commission on Human and People Rights regarding Eritrean political detainees, people of faith, and journalists. This non-cooperation confirms lack of willingness on the part of the government of Eritrea to address the violations in the country, and above all, undermines the UN and African human rights systems. On the other hand, I welcome the recent sanction measures by the European Union and litigation efforts by civil society organizations with regard to individuals and entities suspected of committing human rights violations in Eritrea. I request the Council to exert maximum pressure on the government of Eritrea to honor its obligations and to use all means to improve the human rights of the Eritrean people. Finally, I would like to note that unfortunately, since my appointment, I have not had the opportunity to meet or engage in a constructive dialogue with the Eritrean officials. My request in January 2021 to undertake an official visit to Eritrea remains unanswered. I reiterate my availability and interest in working together with the government of Eritrea on the pressing human rights challenges facing the country. Thank you.
I thank you. According to our practice, we shall start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea. You have 5 minutes.
Madam President, the Human Rights Council is met again with another special report on Eritrea, reflecting the allegations that have characterized the annual report since 2012. The mandate is driven by geopolitical agendas and interests of certain Western powers, harboring the political intent to vilify, isolate, and destabilize Eritrea, and consequently has served as a continuation of regional conflict. Until ousted from power in 2018 after 27 years of rule in Ethiopia, the subversive clique, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, and Eritrean surrogate groups, it harbors served the state's political interests. This ill intent of the report is reflected in its flawed methodology, in a futile attempt to portray systemic failures that negates Eritrea's resilient reality and progress. The report relies on unacceptable human rights benchmarks and is full of presumptuous qualifications. This constitutes a violation of the UN General Assembly Resolution 60/251 and the Code of Conduct of Special Procedures, which demand facts based on objective, reliable information emanating from relevant, credible sources and duly cross-checked. Madam President, after the restoration of the Eritrean and Ethiopian peace in 2018 with impact on revitalizing the Horn of Africa regional dynamics, Eritrea has developed a national development roadmap. Despite the COVID-19 impact, the plan is being used to address the effects of the hostilities imposed on Eritrea and as a basis for post-COVID development dynamics. The mandate's allegations on post-peace reform delays, including on national service, setting unjustified preconditions and pressures for hasty measures are thus unacceptable. In this regard, the Special Rapporteur's observation on national service and forced labor and the national service illegal migration casualty inference is baseless. Despite the futile efforts made as part of the failed hostilities to destabilize Eritrea by luring the youth through illegal worldwide migration networks, the national service system is effective in the upbringing and participation of youth in national development. Moreover, as part of the gradual effort to bring national service back to its statutory duration, various steps are being taken, including the integration of national service members into the new government remuneration system. Madam President, it's unacceptable that the mandate oversteps its responsibility alleged in Eritrea into context of Ethiopia's law enforcement operation in the Tigray region. The measure is in response to TPLF's premeditated attack on Ethiopia's northern military command stationed in the region. The TPLF launched the attack as an initial ground to overthrow the Ethiopian government, with subsequent plans that include invasion on Eritrea to advance its avowed regime change agenda, as well as incorporate sovereign Eritrean territories. Once the hostile plan started to fail, the clique, its diaspora stooges, hired lobbyists to some Western media, and its handlers resorted to disinformation campaign using concocted baseless allegations of sexual violence, looting, and crimes. This is perceived through fabrications, recycling of fake news, and Photoshop with images from other conflicts and events. It's irresponsible that the mandate has followed suit of the same narrative and false propaganda, scapegoating Eritrea in the situation. Moreover, the same external entities and handlers of the TPLF clique that aided and abetted its murderous reign in Ethiopia and in the Horn of Africa for 27 years are again desperately working to resuscitate the clique from this. Ongoing attempts to deflect attention from the crimes of the clique perpetuated and downplaying its culpability is unacceptable and will not serve the cause of peace, security, and human rights and development in the region. Contrary to the false assertions made on Eritrea's failure in cooperation, Eritrea remained committed to dignified engagement and international cooperation based on partnership. In particular, functional measures have been initiated to implement the third GPR cycle recommendation, and the latest CRC and CEDAW reports have been submitted. Moreover, Eritrea remains committed on its three priorities presented for OHCHR technical assistance, but as expressed in the aim of Ministry of Foreign Affairs response, so OHCHR needs to revisit its roadmap accordingly. In conclusion, Eritrea appeals to the UN Human Rights Council not to make decisions relying on unacceptable recommendations that emanates from the present report's flawed methodology, erroneous data, and consequent bleak depiction of Eritrea's reality. Furthermore, Eritrea cannot accept continued injustice and harassment and requests for the termination of a mandate which is unjust, unfair, and has not created dividend in the promotion of human rights. Let me note Finally, let's note also that this statement highlights some salient features of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs response to the present report already communicated publicly. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the Special Rapporteur and to make comments on his report. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union for a video statement.
The EU thanks the Special Rapporteur and reaffirms its support to his mandate. We remain deeply concerned about the human rights situation in Eritrea. In March, the EU imposed restrictive measures on the National Security Agency in response to the commission of serious human rights violations. While welcoming the release of some prisoners since August 20, the EU calls on the government to release all prisoners held for political or religious reasons. The government must end the practice of arbitrary and incommunicado detention and implement a framework for the promotion and protection of all human rights. Regarding the presence of Eritrean troops in Tigray, despite the commitment made on the withdrawal, there is still no evidence of this happening. Withdrawal must be swift, unconditional and verifiable, and fully respect international law. Various reports indicate the commission by Eritrean forces of widespread violations of international law in Tigray. It's paramount to investigate all allegations and ensure that those responsible are brought to justice. We call upon Eritrea to cooperate with the special procedures of the HRC and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and to grant them full and unhindered access upon request. The EU will remain engaged with Eritrea. We welcome Eritrea's partnership with the UN under the Strategic Partnership Cooperation Framework and stand ready to facilitate cooperation. Dr. Babiker, how can the international community best assist you in monitoring the human rights situation in Eritrea with a view to its improvement, alleviate the plight of Eritrean refugees in the region, and engage Eritrea in contributing to a solution in Tigray? I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Norway on behalf of a group of countries for a video statement.
I have the honor of speaking on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his update. We reiterate our grave concerns of Eritrean forces' presence and continuing reports of serious human rights violations in Tigray. We welcome the March agreement between President Afwerki and Prime Minister Abiy on the withdrawal of Eritrean troops from Tigray and call for immediate implementation of the withdrawal. We welcome the ongoing investigation by OHCHR and the Ethiopian Commission for Human Rights of alleged human rights violations and abuses in Tigray. Impunity cannot be accepted. Perpetrators need to be brought to justice in full respect of fair trial guarantees. We remain concerned about persistent human rights violations and abuses in Eritrea. We call upon the government to ensure the respect for all human rights of all its citizens. We strongly encourage the government to implement accepted recommendations from the Universal Periodic Review. Finally, we urge the government to strengthen its engagement with the Council's mechanisms, including by granting the Special Rapporteur full and unhindered access to the country. Dr. Babiker, how can the international community support necessary efforts to improve the human rights situations in Eritrea? Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Liechtenstein for a video statement.
Liechtenstein thanks the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea for his report. Liechtenstein is concerned about the human rights situation within the country, as well as about Eritrea's alleged involvement into the deterioration of the situation in Tigray. It is crucial that all allegations of serious human rights violations, including abductions, extrajudicial killings, and executions of civilians, arbitrary and incommunicado detention, widespread looting, pillage, sexual violence, and the forced return of Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers are investigated in a prompt, thorough, and independent manner. Efficient and transparent institutions that are governed by the rule of law, as well as the separation of powers and checks and balances, are crucial for the protection of human rights in every country. People's participation in the political processes, as well as the enablement of a safe, unrestricted, and free environment for civil society organizations, the political opposition, and independent media are other key factors in this regard. Liechtenstein calls upon Eritrea to fully cooperate with the United Nations entities and the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights, as well as to implement decisions, benchmarks, and recommendations in order to improve the human rights situation in the country. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to France on Zoom.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie le rapporteur spécial pour son rapport et réitère le soutien de la France à son mandat. La situation des droits de l'homme et des libertés fondamentales en Érythrée ne connaît aucune amélioration, malgré nos appels pour que les autorités mettent un terme aux détentions arbitraires, actes de torture, disparitions forcées, restrictions des libertés et réforment le service militaire de durée indéterminée. La France est également préoccupée par les violations des droits de l'homme et du droit international humanitaire commises par l'armée érythréenne dans la région éthiopienne du Tigré. Ces violations sont inacceptables. Leurs auteurs ne doivent pas échapper à la justice. La France appelle de nouveau les autorités érythréennes au retrait sans délai de leurs troupes du Tigré, conformément à l'annonce qui avait été faite à la suite du déplacement du Premier ministre éthiopien à Asmara en mars dernier. Alors que l'Érythrée est membre de ce Conseil, sa coopération avec les mécanismes internationaux de suivi des droits de l'homme demeure insatisfaisante. Dans ces conditions, la France continuera de plaider pour que la situation des droits de l'homme en Érythrée fasse l'objet d'un suivi régulier de ce Conseil. La France soutient le renouvellement du mandat du rapporteur spécial et compte sur le soutien des États membres du Conseil. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Switzerland for a video statement.
Madame la Présidente, la situation des droits de l'homme en Érythrée est préoccupante et la Suisse remercie le rapporteur spécial pour son travail. La Suisse appelle le gouvernement érythréen à renforcer la coopération avec tous les mécanismes des droits de l'homme et à engager un dialogue constructif avec le rapporteur spécial. Nous encourageons la coopération technique avec le Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme et soulignons l'importance de progresser sur les critères établis par l'ancienne rapporteure spéciale. La Suisse estime urgent d'avancer sur le renforcement de la justice et l'état de droit, la réforme du service national et militaire, la liberté de religion, d'association, d'expression et de la presse, ainsi que la lutte contre toutes les formes de violence fondées sur le genre et la promotion des droits des femmes. La Suisse partage les inquiétudes du rapporteur spécial concernant les allégations de violations et atteintes aux droits de l'homme, ainsi que de violations du droit international humanitaire commises, entre autres, par l'armée érythréenne dans la région du Tigré en Éthiopie. Ces allégations doivent faire l'objet d'une enquête approfondie et indépendante. Monsieur le rapporteur spécial, pouvez-vous élaborer sur le type de mesures concrètes nécessaires pour établir l'état des droits et créer un environnement sûr, porteur et libre pour les membres de l'opposition politique, les médias indépendants et les organisations indépendantes de la société civile? Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to Germany for a video statement.
Madam President, Germany aligns with the EU statement. Mr. Special Rapporteur, we thank you for the presentation of your report. It once again depicts the dire reality of the human rights situation in Eritrea. It is very concerning that most of the UPR recommendations made to Eritrea remain unimplemented, while massive restrictions of fundamental human rights such as freedom of expression, religion or belief, as well as assembly and association are still in force. Indefinite incommunicado detention has no place in the 21st century. It is unacceptable that Eritrea does not cooperate with you and your mandate. Stagnancy in the promotion and protection of human rights is disappointing. Even more disappointing is deterioration. The involvement of Eritrean soldiers in human rights violations in Tigray is a grave cause for concern. In your report, you mention extrajudicial killings, widespread sexual and gender-based violence and looting, among others. Mr. Babiker, the list of necessary reforms in Eritrea is long. In your view, what would be a good starting point towards a legal framework that might ensure minimum human rights standards? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Indonesia on Zoom. Indonesia, you have the floor. While we're waiting for Indonesia, I give the floor to Cuba for a video statement.
Señora Presidenta, la cooperación, el diálogo y el intercambio respetuoso entre todos los países, sobre la base de los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, constituyen el camino más efectivo para la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. Este debe ser también el mecanismo para que el Consejo aborde cuestiones de preocupación de la comunidad internacional, o que pueden constituir retos para uno o varios países, en la creación de un entorno propicio para la realización de todos los derechos humanos para todos. Todo ello en contraposición de la politización, la selectividad y los dobles raseros en el tratamiento de los derechos humanos. Señora Presidenta, el Consejo no debe renunciar a explorar y promover la cooperación y el diálogo constructivo y respetuoso con Eritrea. La resolución que da mandato para este diálogo, que no goza de la aceptación del país concernido, va en contra de los principios por los que debe regirse este Consejo. Muchas gracias.
I understand that Eritrea has asked for the floor on a point of order. Could you take the floor, please, and tell us what the point of order is?
Yes, Madam. Thank you, Madam. Yeah, The point of order that I asked for is the overstepping of the mandate to the Tigray conflict. I mean, this is a mandate which is exclusively mandated, if it's at all a mandate, it is exclusively mandated the human rights situation in Eritrea, not in Ethiopia. So this is the point that I would like to flag to the special rapporteur himself and those delegates who try to extend the mandate to the special situation in the law enforcement which is happening in Tigray, which might be addressed somehow in another context. So I would urge, Madam President, all delegates to remain within the discussions of the mandate of the Human Rights Council, which is a mandate of the special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Eritrea. That is my point of order. So I would ask you to delete all interventions which are beyond this mandate, even the mandate of his intervention and the interventions that follow this kind of intervention. I thank you, Madam President. That's the point I would like to flag to other delegates also. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. But I believe that the point of order that you've raised is in relation to the substance of the discussion, and points of order may only be raised in relation to procedure and process. I don't have the power to delete matters that have already been discussed, but we have noted what you have said and your objections. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia for a video statement.
Australia thanks the Special Rapporteur for his oral update. We support the extension of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and repeat our calls on the Eritrean government to cooperate fully with the mandate. Australia remains deeply troubled by reports of detention of members of the Eritrean political opposition, people of faith, journalists and asylum seekers. We strongly encourage Eritrea to establish an effective legal framework to address all forms of discrimination and to uphold the rule of law. We are gravely concerned by the situation in Tigray, Ethiopia, and the ongoing reports of egregious human rights abuses, including systemic sexual and gender-based violence and violations of international humanitarian law committed by Eritrean forces. We note that the Ethiopian government has requested that Eritrean forces leave Tigray, and we call on Eritrea to do so immediately. We also call on Eritrea to investigate the allegations against its forces to ensure those responsible are held to account. We ask Dr. Babika for his views on why rates of arbitrary detention are not declining, despite positive trends in prisoner release.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. To our observation, some special procedure mandate holders often debate from the standard rules and practice with the publication of documents based on erroneous data and unverified allegations, thereby damaging the credibility of the human rights mechanism as a whole. We are of the view that any debates based on procedures and aimed at political objective is not conducive but counterproductive to the genuine promotion and protection of human rights, and therefore such practice should be discontinued. The genuine willingness and preparedness of the government of Eritrea for the promotion and protection of human rights and effort to that end should be duly taken into account and further encouraged. The HRC and OHCHR should avoid application of politicization, selectivity and double standards in the field of human rights, and encourage the constructive dialogue and cooperation to promote understanding of the different realities and to explore effective ways for the promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to China for a video statement.
主席女士，中方赞赏厄立特里亚政府积极推动经济社会发展，提高人民生活水平，抗击新冠肺炎疫情，保障弱势群体权利，积极参加国别人权审议。厄特人权状况特别报告员提交的报告采用未经证实的信息，重复以往针对厄特的指责，未能全面客观反映厄特真实情况，我们对此深表关切。报告的大量内容 涉及埃塞俄比亚、提勒雷州的形势，这也超出了特别报告人的授权。中方一贯主张各国在人权领域开展建设性对话与合作，反对将人权问题政治化和干涉内政的行径。我们呼吁人权理事会不再设立厄特人权状况特别报告员。谢谢主席女士。
Thank you, and I give the floor to the Netherlands on Zoom.
Madam President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank Special Rapporteur Dr. Babbeke for his report and reaffirm our full support for his mandate. We remain deeply worried about the continued existence of indefinite national service and other systemic violations of human rights in Eritrea. In spite of reports of the release of some prisoners, the situation regarding arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances and religious persecution remains worrisome. We therefore urge Eritrea to release all prisoners of faith, journalists and political prisoners. Regarding the Tigray conflict and Eritrean involvement, we call for an independent investigation into reported war crimes and human rights violations by all parties, including rape as a weapon of war, and into the fate of thousands of Eritrean refugees in Tigray and other regions. Eritrea, as a member of this Council, has a special responsibility to uphold the highest human rights standards. We urge Eritrea to cooperate with the UN Special Rapporteur and with all other mechanisms of this Council. Dr. Babbeke, how can we assist you in reaching out to the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea regarding the fate of the Eritrean refugees affected by the war in Tigray region? Thank you.
Thank you, and I advise all delegations that the list of speakers is closed. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela. You have the floor.
Gracias, Presidenta. Debemos abordar nuevamente la presentación de un informe sobre Eritrea que repite muchas de las infundadas acusaciones características de los informes publicados desde el establecimiento del mandato del relator especial en 2012. Venezuela no apoya estos mandatos impuestos contra los países del sur, menos aún cuando no cuentan con la aceptación del Estado concernido. Eritrea ha cooperado activamente con este Consejo y sus mecanismos, brindando abundante información sobre sus esfuerzos en la protección de los derechos humanos de su pueblo. El país cumplió exitosamente con su tercera revisión ante el mecanismo del examen periódico universal. La comunidad de naciones debe brindar el apoyo que Eritrea requiere para la aplicación de las recomendaciones del EPU, mecanismo idóneo para abordar las cuestiones de derechos humanos en pie de igualdad entre los estados. Los mandatos contra países vulneran los principios del respeto a la soberanía y no injerencia en los asuntos internos estatales consagrados en la Carta de Naciones Unidas. Es hora de que el Consejo cese este enfoque improductivo que ha conducido a 8 años perdidos, sin más resultado que el despilfarro de los escasos recursos disponibles, y se ponga fin al mandato impuesto a Eritrea. Reiteramos la necesidad de que el Consejo cumpla con su mandato de promover y proteger los derechos humanos sobre la base de un diálogo genuino y la cooperación, pilares fundamentales de su labor. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United States for a video statement.
Thank you for your presentation. The United States strongly condemns Eritrea's continued troop presence in Ethiopia's Tigray region and calls for the immediate and verifiable withdrawal of Eritrean forces in Tigray. We remain gravely concerned that Eritrean government forces continue to commit human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings, rape, and sexual violence, and by credible reports that they are forcibly returning Eritrean refugees to Eritrea. We also remain gravely concerned about their role in preventing humanitarian access to populations in Tigray, directly contributing to conditions of famine. We call for those responsible for human rights abuses or violations of international law to be investigated and held accountable, and highlight Eritrea's responsibility to do so. Beyond the situation in Tigray, we remain concerned by reports of arbitrary detention within Eritrea, including of individuals arrested for exercising freedom of expression, religion or belief, or peaceful assembly, as well as conscientious objectors of compulsory and indefinite national service. Reports of pervasive abuses, including torture, of detainees are deeply troubling. Has the government of Eritrea taken measures to investigate human rights abuses or allegations of violations of international law by its forces and to hold those responsible accountable?
Thank you, and I give the floor to Saudi Arabia for a video statement.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. بداية ترحب بعثة بلادي بالمقرر الخاص المعني بحالة حقوق الإنسان في أريتريا، وقد اطلعت بعثة بلادي باهتمام على التقرير المقدم لهذه الدورة، وأخذت علما بتوصيات واستنتاجات الواردة في التقرير. السيد الرئيس، تثمن بلادي جهود الحكومة الأريترية الرامية للتعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان على الرغم من التحديات والصعوبات التي تواجهها، وتشكر لها تعاونها مع الجهات الفاعلة الإقليمية والدولية وتدعوها لمواصلة تلك الجهود والتعاون. السيد الرئيس، إن المملكة تؤيد وتساعد في جهود إحلال السلام بما يعزز من حماية واحترام حقوق الإنسان، كما أن بلادي على استعداد للحفاظ على التواصل والتنسيق مع المجتمع الدولي والاستمرار في لعب دور بناء في تعزيز الحوار، حيث لطالما أيدت بلاد الحوار البناء والتعاون في مجال حقوق الإنسان، ومن ضمن ذلك اتفاق السلام بين إريتريا وأثيوبيا الذي تم توقيعه في سبتمبر عام 2018 ميلادي.
Thank you. I give the floor to Austria for a video statement.
Thank you. Austria aligns itself with the statement by the EU. I would like to thank Dr. Babiker for your report and reaffirm my country's full support to the mandate. Austria regrets that the human rights situation in Eritrea hardly shows any sign of improvement. We remain deeply concerned about the continued practice of indefinite national service, arbitrary detention and forced disappearances, as well as the severe restrictions on the exercise of freedom of expression, freedom of religion or belief, and the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. It is regrettable that despite the deploring human rights situation in Eritrea, the government's cooperation with international and regional human rights mechanisms remains very limited. As a member of this Council, Eritrea has a special duty to uphold the highest human rights standards and to fully cooperate with the Council and its mechanisms. We call on the government to engage constructively with special procedures and the Office of the High Commissioner, inter alia, on the implementation of the recommendations emanating from the Universal Periodic Review. Finally, in the light of the implications of the Eritrean military in serious human rights violations in the Ethiopian region of Tigray, we reiterate our call for the immediate withdrawal of Eritrean troops from Ethiopia. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Sri Lanka for a video statement.
Sri Lanka believes that politically motivated action, including country-specific resolutions and reports on human rights situations of states, do not serve the purpose of improving the human rights situation of any country. Rather, such actions based on unsubstantiated evidence only results in further deteriorating the credibility and integrity of this Council. Any action with the genuine interest of improving the human rights standards of a state should be in consultation and in collaboration with the country concerned, respecting the principles of sovereign equality and non-interference enshrined in the UN Charter. We believe that the Universal Periodic Review is the appropriate mechanism in this regard, in which Eritrea has been actively engaged with and is in the process of implementing the accepted recommendations. Eritrea has expressed commitment to addressing all remaining challenges and achieving its human rights targets so as to reach its key objective, which is creating a socially just society. Sri Lanka encourages the Council to take an objective approach to the situation in Eritrea and to engage in a positive dialogue with the government of Eritrea. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Sudhan on Zoom.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يشكر السودان المقرر المعني بحالة حقوق الإنسان في إريتريا على استعراض تقريره الذي اطلعنا عليه بعناية، ونود أن نشدد على الآتي. أولا، يجدد السودان موقفه المعلن والثابت بشأن أهمية تعزيز أوضاع حقوق الإنسان في جميع أنحاء العالم، ويؤكد في الوقت نفسه أهمية التعاون المشترك والبناء من جميع الأطراف بما يحقق ذلك. ثانيا، يلفت الانتباه إلى أهمية الالتزام بالمبادئ الأساسية التي قام عليها مجلس حقوق الإنسان، وفي هذا الإطار يرى أن استصحاب رؤية الحكومة الإريترية بشأن كيفية وشكل التعاون الذي يمكن أن يقوم بينها وبين آليات حقوق الإنسان هو أمر مهم وضروري. ثالثا، يأمل أن تزيد الحكومة الإريترية من وتيرة تعاونها مع مجلس حقوق الإنسان وآلياته المختلفة وما يحقق مصلحة الشعب الإريتري الشقيق. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to Belarus for a video statement.
Госпожа председатель, Прежде всего, хотели бы подтвердить, что Беларусь не поддерживает принятие страновых резолюций и учреждение страновых мандатов без согласия на то правительств затронутых государств. Мы не переставая подчеркиваем, что страновые резолюции и созданные ими мандаты являются политическими инициативами, далекими от благих намерений в сфере прав человека. В последнее время на примере некоторых поступков УВКПЧ и отдельных мандатов СПЧ мы смогли убедиться в этом еще больше. Хотим также подчеркнуть, что никакой добавленной стоимости от страновых мандатов нет. Мы уже выражали наше несогласие с необоснованно частым обсуждением в СПЧ ситуации с правами человека в Эритрее. Не услышали от спецдокладчика ничего нового, чтобы вновь обсуждать этот вопрос спустя 3 месяца после завершения 46-й сессии Совета. А вот что нас реально беспокоит, так это ухудшение ситуации в сфере прав человека в странах-авторах резолюции по Эритрее, включая Нидерланды, Чехию, Латвию, Литву, Польшу, Эстонию и других. Множество сообщений говорят о внутренних проблемах в этих странах. Однако они всячески уклоняются от их обсуждения в Совете и при этом регулярно лезут в огород к соседу. Поэтому мы выступаем за обеспечение должного мониторинга правозащитной ситуации в западных странах. Вновь призываем Совет переосмыслить отношение к роли страновых мандатов, в том числе по Эритрее. Благодарю.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ireland for a video statement.
Aligns with the statement of the EU and thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. The situation of human rights in Eritrea, a member of this Council, is of great concern. We note that there has been little to no improvement in the 5 areas identified in the benchmarks for progress. The situation remains grave in relation to the administration of justice and the rights to freedom of expression and of religion or belief, assembly and movement. Arbitrary arrests continue, as well as incommunicado detention and indefinite national service. In the wider region, Eritrea has a role to play in securing peace and development, and an obligation to promote human rights and ensure respect for international humanitarian law. We are extremely concerned by allegations that Eritrean forces have committed widespread violations of international humanitarian, human rights and refugee law in the Tigray region of Ethiopia since November 2020. The situation for Eritrean refugees is of particular concern. We strongly support the ongoing investigations into these allegations. We echo the Special Rapporteur's call on Eritrea to cooperate with UN and African Union human rights mechanisms to address these human rights challenges. Special Rapporteur, how can states and the international community better support efforts to ensure accountability, direct and indirect, for human rights violations in Eritrea? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Belgium for a video statement.
My country regrets that the human rights situation in Eritrea remains dire. As the Special Rapporteur describes in his report, in the absence of constitution, parliamentary or independent judiciary, there can be no rule of law, and as a consequence, the population continues to live at the mercy of the authorities. Individuals are incarcerated in the most harsh conditions for daring to exercise fundamental freedoms. National or military service continues to rob the younger generation of their right to education. Women are vulnerable to sexual abuse, which goes unpunished. The involvement of Eritrean military forces in the conflict in Tigray and the alleged participation in the most serious human rights violations against civilians is cause for alarm. The conduct of its armed forces is the responsibility of the government, which should guarantee compliance with international obligations. Accountability is of paramount importance in achieving durable peace and reconciliation. We therefore reiterate our call for an independent investigation into all allegations and for an effective prosecution of those deemed responsible for those crimes. As a member of this Council, Eritrea has a duty to uphold its international human rights obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Somalia for a video statement.
Thank you, Chair. In recent years, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea have shown good regional cooperation following the historical peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea. The cooperation among the 3 countries has opened a new chapter in regional peace, stability, and cooperation among them. Somalia takes note of the report. Despite the challenges, Eritrea have achieved significant development results in all areas, including the human rights domain. It's promising to see that Eritrea is seizing this opportunity to fast-track this development agenda. Somalia encourages Eritrea to further consolidate its engagement and cooperation on human rights. The federal government of Somalia's position regarding the report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea is very clear and has been communicated through a statement from the Minister of Information and other appropriate channels. It's very unfortunate that the report illustrates a false narrative in which the Somali government's forces are involved in the recent conflict in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. It's worth clarifying that these troops mentioned in the report are not connected to the federal government of Somalia. These claims in the report were then used to incite the parents of these young men who have chosen to train in order to fight extremism, strengthen Somali security, and bring about stability to Somalia. This led the government of Somalia ensuring all those being trained to call home and reassure their parents of the fallacy of what has been reported. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United Kingdom on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. The United Kingdom welcomes the Special Rapporteur's report and continues to call on Eritrea to cooperate fully with its mandate. We thank the Special Rapporteur for including in his report disturbing allegations of atrocities and violations of international humanitarian law in Tigray by Eritrean forces. We are further concerned that Eritrean forces there are responsible for widespread sexual violence, extrajudicial killings, and willfully impeding access to millions of Tigrayans in need of humanitarian aid. International use of starvation of civilians as a weapon of war is completely unacceptable. We call on Eritrea to fulfill its commitment to withdraw from the Tigray region immediately. It is essential that all those responsible for human rights violations and abuses be held to account. Special Rapporteur, we share your disappointment that recommendations from Eritrea's 2019 UPR have not yet been implemented and continue to urge the government to do so. We continue to press the Eritrean government to end the indefinite nature of its national service. We welcome the release over the past year of around 200 individuals imprisoned on religious grounds, but call for the release of all others arbitrarily and indefinitely detained for exercising their human rights and fundamental freedoms. Special Rapporteur, what should Eritrea's regional and strategic partners be doing to encourage it to comply fully with its human rights obligations? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ethiopia on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the Special Rapporteur for his report, which we take note of. Ethiopia expressed dismay at the statement and allegations made against it in the report. What is even more disheartening is that no attempt whatsoever has been made to contact the delegation to verify the veracity of the allegations. With the COVID-19 pandemic having a disproportionate impact on development initiative, we also applaud Eritrea for recalibrating efforts through the adoption of a new national development roadmap accompanied by 9 strategic programs. We also note with appreciation Eritrea's engagement with various regional and international human rights bodies and mechanisms. In this regard, its candid participation in the third UPR cycle, its submission of the 6th report under CEDAW, the combined FIGS and the 9th CRC, as well as second report on the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, demonstrates its commitment to engage further. In closing, we encourage Eritrea to implement the accepted recommendations from UPR process and to collaborate with partners on the country's identified priorities for strengthening various capacities related to respect, protection, and the fulfillment of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Djibouti for a video statement.
Djibouti welcomes the Special Rapporteur and thanks him for his report and hopes that our exchange today will be an opportunity for a constructive dialogue. My government welcomed the peace and reconciliation dynamic in our region since 2018. Djibouti believes that the commitment and engagement of all countries in the region will strengthen the regional integration and cooperation. The opportunities created by peace and dialogue are far-reaching and with no doubt shall positively impact the protection and promotion of human rights, as well as the upholding of humanitarian law. Last year, my delegation updated the Human Rights Council on the fate of the 19 Eritrean prisoners of war under its custody and was pleased to report that they were being resettled as refugees in a third country with the assistance of UNHCR and ICRC. My delegation thanks the Special Rapporteur for his update on the situation of Djiboutian prisoners in his report, which highlights a lack of information and progress on the issue of the fate of these prisoners. Djibouti remains deeply concerned by the lack of information on the 13 remaining Djiboutian prisoners unaccounted for and held incommunicado in Eritrean custody, and call on Eritrea to share information on the fate of these prisoners with relevant stakeholders. Djibouti remains committed and firmly believes that the normalization of relations between Djibouti and Eritrea, if sustained by meaningful and genuine engagement by both sides, shall contribute to solve the issue related to the fate of Djiboutian prisoners of war and other pending issues. The Special Rapporteur, the OHCHR, and the Human Rights Council are encouraged to continue engaging positively with Eritrea, and I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Russian Federation for a video statement.
Госпожа председатель, последовательно выступаем против политизации правозащитной проблематики и использования в качестве повода для вмешательства во внутренние дела государств. Сегодня нет ни одной страны, которая не сталкивалась бы с проблемами в области защиты прав человека. Задача международного сообщества как раз и заключается в том, чтобы оказывать государствам посильное содействие в их решении при неукоснительном соблюдении норм международного права и уважении суверенитета. Именно такое равноправное, взаимоуважительное и конструктивное взаимодействие как никогда необходимо Эритрее, где на протяжении длительного времени сохраняется сложная экономическая обстановка, оказывающая серьезное воздействие на внутреннюю ситуацию в целом. Между тем, рассмотрение эритрейского досье в СПЧ по-прежнему носит предвзятый характер, призываем отказаться от этой порочной практики. Со своей стороны приветствуем усилия властей Эритреи по налаживанию конструктивных отношений с соседями. Позитивно оцениваем договоренность политического руководства Эритреи и Эфиопии о выводе эритрейских вооруженных подразделений из региона Тиграй. Убеждены, что реализация этой важной договоренности будет способствовать укреплению мира и стабильности на Африканском роге. Отмечаем также шаги по укреплению национального потенциала в области поощрения и защиты прав человека. Надеемся, что власти Эритреи приложат все усилия для их безусловного соблюдения. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Philippines for a video statement.
Thank you, Chair. We note the report of the SR pursuant to HRC Resolution 44/1. The Philippines voted against this resolution on account of the developments on the ground and the unconscionable cost of maintaining the mandate. While the SR stressed in his report the need for the government to engage in technical cooperation, he failed to identify any concrete opportunities for possible extension of technical assistance, particularly in the so-called 5 benchmarks for progress. This could have demonstrated the sincerity of the mandate to render constructive and practical assistance to the country concerned, especially in these pandemic circumstances. The interactive dialogue alone costs $216,000 for interpretation services and so-called pre-session documentation. The annual budget requirement of nearly $500,000, around half of which are for the salary of a P3 level UN staff, is clearly without any actual or potential benefit to the country concerned or to stakeholders on the ground in terms of capacity building, practical assistance, or support for any concrete program. We are convinced that the Council has exhausted this cycle of mandate and must move forward on this. The OHCHR 2020 report has already shown that it can render assistance without being triggered by a mandate from the Council. The full statement will be uploaded. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I give the floor to Cameroon on Zoom.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Mon pays prend bonne note du rapport qui vient d'être présenté sur l'Érythrée et remercie le rapporteur spécial. Ce qui se joue ici dans ce Conseil, c'est certes la situation des droits de l'homme, mais c'est beaucoup plus la situation de vulnérabilité que vit ce pays. Je ne voudrais pas rentrer dans les manquements relevés par le rapporteur spécial, tout comme les multiples reproches qui sont faits au rapporteur spécial sur son approche et sur les résultats jugés critiquables par le gouvernement d'Érythrée. C'est pourquoi mon gouvernement plaide, sans toutefois demander au Conseil, aux mécanismes de droits de l'homme d'amender leur mode de travail, mais de mettre davantage l'accent sur l'homme. Personne ici, Madame la Présidente, ne peut s'occuper des situations des Érythréens que les Érythréens eux-mêmes et leur gouvernement. Raison pour laquelle mon gouvernement recommande une approche basée sur la coopération avec les acteurs en présence. Il ne faudrait pas que nous nous trompions d'objectif. L'objectif ici, c'est le respect et la protection des droits de l'homme avec la finalité l'homme. Ma délégation appelle à une approche pédagogique qui met l'accent sur la coopération pour mettre fin à cette situation de dialogue de sourds. Une telle approche permettra d'éviter l'aggravation des situations sur le terrain et rester dans un esprit constructif. Cette approche centrée sur l'homme permettra d'envoyer un message d'espoir à ce peuple meurtri par tant de souffrance. Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua on Zoom.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Nicaragua reconoce los esfuerzos del gobierno de Eritrea por consolidar sus marcos institucionales y jurídicos, incluidos sus valiosos logros en materia de administración de la justicia, promoción de los derechos económicos, sociales y culturales, empoderamiento de la mujer, defensa de los derechos del niño y de las personas con discapacidad. Es importante destacar además que los modestos pero loables logros de Eritrea en la expansión de los servicios sociales y la seguridad alimentaria, a pesar de los considerables retos económicos y de seguridad nacional a los que se ha enfrentado, han sido reconocidos por las Naciones Unidas y otros socios del desarrollo. Rechazamos enfáticamente los dobles raseros y la politización de los mecanismos de este Consejo en contra de gobiernos legítimos en desacato a los principios de igualdad social, integridad territorial e independencia política de los Estados. Estamos convencidos que los derechos humanos solo pueden promoverse a través de un diálogo genuino y la cooperación internacional constructiva. Por ello consideramos que el informe como el que hoy se presenta sobre Eritrea, lejos de incentivar los esfuerzos de los países para lograr la paz y el progreso, promueven comportamientos malintencionados y incuestionables intereses políticos. Instamos a que las conversaciones sobre derechos humanos se lleven a cabo bajo el compromiso del respeto a la soberanía de los pueblos que defienden su derecho inherente para decidir sobre su futuro y a que se asume el compromiso constructivo de evitar promover iniciativas que generen inestabilidad en países que se debaten para resolver sus propios problemas internos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And we will now turn to the list of speakers for non-government organizations. And I give the floor to the representative of the Jubilee Campaign.
Jubilee Campaign and Human Rights Concern Eritrea thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. Nothing has changed in the government's attitude. The Eritrean government continues to take no action to remedy multiple violations. There is no religious liberty, and the government recently closed the last remaining Catholic-owned and operated educational institutions, including early and intermediate primary schools throughout the country. The government has not reformed the National Military Service Program, limited its time, or demobilized conscripts. Instead, thousands of the Eritrean forces currently in Tigray are conscripts held illegally and indefinitely in national service. Eritrea is also sending children under 18 to the front lines in Tigray in breach of international law on the treatment of minors in armed conflict. Many reports of murder, massacre and rape in Tigray have been linked to Eritrean soldiers. It is clear Eritrean military forces are still very much present in Tigray, and the Eritrean government has ignored calls to withdraw its forces. The work of the Special Rapporteur on Eritrea is needed more than ever, and his mandate must be renewed. Thank you.
Thank you. And this was the last speaker that we could accommodate today. I understand that certain delegations have requested to exercise the right of reply. The distinguished representative of Ethiopia, you have 3 minutes.
Madam President, we are exercising our right of reply in response to certain delegations and civil society organization statements regarding Eritrean refugees hosted by Ethiopia. Ethiopia's critical role as a host country for a million refugees is well known. Prior to the start of the law enforcement operation in Tigray, close to 200,000 Eritrean refugees were hosted in and out of camps located throughout the country. Out of this, 50,000 Eritrean refugees were hosted in 4 camps throughout the Tigray region, while the remainder were hosted in various cities throughout the region. The Administration of Refugees and Returnees Affairs has been coordinating the relocation of Eritrean refugees from the conflict-affected Shimalba and Hisas camps to the safer Mai Aini and Adi Harush camps in order to protect the refugees from the terrorist TPLF sporadic and guerrilla tactic war. We are aware of the concerns expressed about the plight of Eritrean refugees, including food shortages and in-camp and alleged reports of grave human rights and humanitarian law violations. Efforts have been made to hold those responsible for crimes accountable, to resume essential humanitarian assistance service, including the delivery of food and non-food items to refugees, and to assist them in re-establishing a normal life in camps and host communities. To put things together into perspective, the Shimelba camp is located only 20 kilometers from the Eritrean border, which violates international standards. It should have been located at least 50 kilometers from the country of origin's border. On the other hand, the Hisas camp is situated in an inhospitable location. That is why Ethiopia's government is attempting to relocate refugees to Ma'aini and Adi Harush by rectifying the TPLF's colossal error. The government of Ethiopia remains committed to investigate all human rights violations allegedly committed against Eritrean refugees by any actor, whether inside or outside the camps. Additionally, it would like to emphasize that the alleged crimes and right violations against refugees are being investigated by the Federal Police and the Federal Attorney General. As a result, perpetrators would be prosecuted and convicted based on the law and evidence as determined by the investigation's findings. I thank you.
May I ask if there are any further requests for the floor to exercise the right of reply? I see none. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this meeting.